The death of Freddie Gray in the back of a police van was no accident, and even worse, it wasn't unique. All too often, suspects needlessly die while in police custody, and oftentimes these deaths are simply written off with no real investigation and no consequences for the officers involved. This has become an epidemic in America, and I have attorney David Haynes with me now to explain how bad this problem really is. So, David, obviously, the Freddie Gray case, we're getting rulings now from the court saying that nobody's going to be prosecuted for this. Oh, what a horrible accident it was. It's always an accident, when someone dies in police custody. And the Freddie Gray case is not unique at all. I mean, we see things happen all the time when people are in the custody of police. But to take us back for just a moment and kind of lay out what happened with Freddie Gray.
Well, the Freddie Gray case, of course, received a lot of national attention, and there hasn't been enough awareness within the police department as well as the public at large regarding in-custody police deaths of unarmed individuals. And this was a transportation case involving Mr. Gray, who was unarmed, he was handcuffed, and he was not properly secured in the back of a paddy wagon. And it came out that the Baltimore Police Department is known for giving these inmates or people who are being transported into custody, quote, rough rides. There's even a sign on the back of the van about that, enjoy your rough ride or something to that extent. And so essentially being handcuffed behind his back, placed on his stomach, he's defenseless. And the allegation is that based on the ride in the paddy wagon, that he suffered a severe spinal injury and a transection of the spinal cord, which is very difficult to do, to have that sort of level of trauma, and as a result was paralyzed and then later died from those injuries that he suffered in the custody in custody death, of course, then resulting in the very prolonged and significant rioting and of Baltimore City, unfortunately, which was the civil unrest was needed to bring attention to the subject. Of course, the rioting was regretful, but now we've been in the series of criminal trials, and of course the standard, as your viewers know, is much more difficult, it's much higher bar, which is beyond a reasonable doubt that these officers were criminally culpable, which is difficult to prove. We've had the first jury a deadlock and a mistrial, and then we've had two subsequent bench trials for the other two individuals, both resulting in acquittal. So it appears that it's going to be very difficult to get an actual criminal conviction against any of these officers.
And, we've seen that it's very difficult to get a conviction of a police officer in a lot of the shooting deaths. And, but that's a separate issue. Today we're talking about the deaths that happen in police custody. And again, Freddie Gray was not a unique example. He wasn't even an exception. It just happened to be that one got so much attention for how gruesome it was. But I know you personally have handled cases of deaths in police custody. There have been numerous reports, especially just in the city of Baltimore, of how many people have died while in the custody of police. So lay it out just overall how bad this problem really is.
It really is. It's a failure on several levels that have resulted in these tragedies. And what we have is a lot of these paddy wagons are not properly equipped. So you have an equipment failure, and then you also have training failures, and you have a cultural, a police department culture issue where they're not sensitive to the needs and what their responsibilities are when you have an in-custody transport. And what your obligations are. Sometimes we have general orders that are in place, but in the litigation that we've been involved in, we found that the officers really were never trained on it. They don't understand the importance of it incredibly enough. So these individuals who are being transported are often not restrained at all by a shoulder harness or anything else. Their hands have been handcuffed behind them, and so they're defenseless. And a lot of times what happens is as simple as the paddy wagon will come to an abrupt stop, and the individual may be thrown forward and hit their head. There were remarkable similarities in the Freddie Gray case and the case of Gregory Davis, which is not a name that has been publicized. The family that we represented on June 23rd of 2011 here in the District of Columbia was a similar thing. He was picked up in a park for concerns about intoxication, was placed in the back of the paddy wagon, was handcuffed, and there was no shoulder restraint, and there was no police officer accompanying him. The paddy wagon pulled off, made a stop, And by the time they got someone else to put in the back of the paddy wagon and open up the doors, Mr. Davis was on the floor. He had an abrasion on his head, and he was complaining that his arms and hands were tingling. And they moved him without putting him on a back brace or any sort of securement. And shortly thereafter, he was paralyzed. And for 6 months, he fought for his life, only to later die from his injuries. So unfortunately, Freddie Gray is not an isolated situation. And although this might not be intentional conduct, it's very negligent conduct. And we need to we have to do better than this and hold our departments, police departments, to a higher standard.
And what's interesting here is that a lot of times, just like with Freddie Gray, he had not been charged with anything. They had picked him up, but he had not been charged. He, in the eyes of the law at the moment, was not a criminal. He was not convicted of anything. Same thing with the gentleman you just described in the park. I mean, they had not yet been charged. They had not gone to court. No jury had decided anything. But these officers decided, I guess, to take the law in their own hands and, kind of give these people what they feel they deserve. I mean, is that what happens?
Well, you raise a very good point, and that is that the police officers need to be aware, and they should be trained upon, the severity of the offense and whether or not even an in-transport custody arrangement is necessary, and if so, what kind. If an individual is intoxicated or inebriated, and that's the only offense that is a concern. In the case of Mr. Davis, our client, it was an open container and concern about public intoxication. And the guidelines for the department were that he should have been transported in a police cruiser, and it really should be dealt with more of as a medical situation rather than a police action situation. It certainly was not a felony, and it was essentially an open container. Public drunkenness is more like a ticketed type of offense, and instead it cost this man his life. Freddie Gray also, I think he had run from the police. They wanted to question him. He was not, there was certainly no active felony or shooting or anything like that. There was concern about drug activity in the area that he was in. And so this is a situation where, they have to be they need to be more sensitive to the nature of the stop and also what the transport. A paddy wagon can be a very dangerous way to be transported, and we need to have reforms in our training. We need to have paddy wagons that have the appropriate restraints, because it's just not appropriate for someone to lose their life over the suspicion of a very minor misdemeanor.
And so we've talked about the fact that it's very difficult to get any kind of criminal conviction in these types of cases. But what about the civil cases that come forward? I know, you've mentioned you've done some. We've seen others come out. Do those have any effect on the conduct of the officers at a particular police precinct?
You would expect that there would be more reform, hopefully, from the litigation. I believe that the civil litigation is making a difference. It highlights issues. In our case, I know that there was a Department of Justice investigation. They failed to bring any criminal charges against the officers. There were some reforms that were instituted, and paddy wagons were retrofitted. So we can shine some light and bring some sunlight onto the situation, and hopefully bring about reforms. The Freddie Gray case, your viewers may recall, was settled for a significant sum of money prior to any of the criminal charges going forward. Hopefully reforms are underway in the department. There are a lot of concerns in the Baltimore City Police Department over excessive force. There certainly are a lot of challenges in that city for the police force, which have to be recognized, and other issues at play as well. And we ask a lot of our police officers to go in these dangerous situations, but when they're when they're confronted with a person who's unarmed, this person should not die in custody. And when you look at the statistics and the numbers of particularly unarmed African Americans who are dying in police custody at a rate of 5 times the rate of unarmed white people, a lot of questions are raised, a lot of concerns, and a lot of times the only answers that, the only way these issues are being explored is through civil litigation. So that is absolutely a necessary process, because the criminal standard is quite high, and it's the blue wall. Basically, these officers are protecting one another, and they're being investigated by their own and internal affairs. So usually these things are swept under the rug. Our firm has been doing police civil rights work for decades, and until the situation in Ferguson with Michael Brown and Freddie Gray in the last couple years, there really hasn't been a public awareness of these situations. And now I want to mention the body cameras too, of course, which are very important that we have the body cameras, because otherwise it's just a he said, she said situation, and we can never prove what actually happened. And of course, in the Freddie Gray situation, there's no video footage from the back of the paddy wagon, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And it's important to point out too, it is not all police officers. It is not even most police officers. There are bad apples in the profession, just as there are in every profession. And it's those people, those bad apples, that we need to take a closer look at. Get them out of the police force if we have to. Make stricter requirements before they can go into law enforcement. And hopefully by doing that, by people demanding change, demand that Congress take action and increase the standards for police officers. That is one possible way that we can put an end to this and stop this needless killing of people who have not even been convicted or accused of a crime. And David Haynes, what you're doing out there is certainly helping the situation. You're fighting for these families of the victims. So thank you very much. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Farron, for highlighting this issue.